Welcome to ALS Today. This is Michelle Flum reporting. Today, we turn our attention to clinical trials. Dozens of possible medicines have been tested for ALS, but only riluzole is FDA approved and at best modestly treats the disease. In recent years, a number of changes have been made to clinical trial process in hopes to bring a better ALS medicine to the shelf. But some experts argue that more could be done now to develop a better medicine for the disease. Joining us to talk about clinical trials is neurologist Rick Bedlack, director of the ALS Clinic at the Duke University School of Medicine. Thank you for joining us today, Rick.
Pleasure to be here with you, Michelle. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you. While we're at the time of the most incredible discovery in ALS, we're at the same time still facing many challenges towards developing a better treatment for this disease. What do you think are the biggest challenges?
I think we have three problems right now that are hampering our attempt to find a cure for ALS. The first one is an incomplete understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease, and maybe even more importantly, of the reason for the variability in progression rate between patients. Where some patients live only a few months from their first symptoms and others live for decades. Somewhere in there, I think Mother Nature's trying to give us a clue as to how we could slow ALS down if we could only understand it. The good news is, as far as that one goes, we've had some recent discoveries that might help us. You've probably read about the C9orf72 discovery, which may turn out to be the most common identifiable cause of ALS in history. And also more recently, the FA4 discovery made by Dr. Brown right here in Boston. In which he showed that patients who have very slow progression seem to have a variation in that gene. So if we could just understand a little more about what that gene does, we might be able to figure out how to slow ALS down more effectively. The second problem that we have is in measurement. And there really we have two issues. One is diagnosis. It takes way too long to make a diagnosis, on average more than a year. And so by the time we can make a diagnosis of ALS, more than half the motor neuron pool is probably lost. Puts us behind the eight ball in terms of trying to salvage someone's nervous system. We've also got a problem in terms of our outcome measures, the ways that we use to try to figure out if patients are getting worse, getting better, and at what speed. The measurements that we have are noisy and fairly slow to change. And as a result of that, our trials have to be very large, usually hundreds of patients in each arm, and they have to go on for a long time, months or sometimes even up to a year, to figure out if what we have actually worked. And then finally, there's the third problem, which to me is the most interesting and surprising, and that's the enrollment problem. It's not unique to ALS, but it is surprising that only a small percentage of people, less than 10% with ALS, enroll in clinical trials. On average, busy centers that do trials enroll about 2 patients per center per month, and at the same time, they probably see more than 50 patients in that same month.
Right. So when we're thinking about the changes in clinical trials, though, a lot of what's been happening is changes in how those clinical trials are being done. We're hearing a lot today about adaptive clinical trial designs, crossovers, futilities, whatever, different ways to basically to get these drugs through more quickly, facilitate go, no-go decisions, and potentially speed up the development of disease. A lot of those clinical trial designs in some way take out the placebo factor. So do you think that those kinds of clinical trial designs, while at the same time speeding up that process, also encourage more people to participate?
I think it's possible. So we've been trying to understand this enrollment problem now for about a decade. And one of the first things we did is we built a model to try to predict the enrollment rate in previously published ALS clinical trials. The enrollment rate is low, but it's highly variable. Some trials enroll 0.2 patients per center per month, and others enroll like 8 or 9 patients per center per month. So there's got to be something that some of these trials are doing that influences enrollment rate. And so our first thought was, well, it must be the trials themselves. There must be something different about the designs of the studies. And so we built this model in which we plugged in all the different trial design factors we could think of, whether it was a large or a small trial, whether it had a placebo group or not, and if it did, how many patients got randomized to get drug versus placebo. Was it a 1-to-1 or was it a 2-to-1 or even greater? Everything we could think of, and none of those trial design factors seemed to predict enrollment rate. And so I personally think, as others in other fields who've studied the same problem, that patient factors, things like awareness, burdens, fears of things being done to you without your knowledge, all those kinds of things play a much greater role than the trial design themselves. And also doctor factors. And doctor factors include things like lack of awareness of trials, lack of enthusiasm for trials, burdens such as time. Well, doctors are increasingly stretched, and there may not be time for doctors individually to go in and talk to patients about research like we used to be able to do. So I think those things probably play a bigger impact. Now, having said that, we have sent some surveys around to patients, and certainly there are some patients who look at clinical trials as a way to try to get a medicine that will help them. And that's the reason why they do or do not enroll, the chances of them getting something that will help. The good news is that's not the number one reason why people choose to go into clinical trials. The number one reason is for the greater good. And so when you go into a trial, if that's your main motivation, which really that's what it should be, for the greater good, to push everybody closer to a cure, it doesn't matter what the design looks like.
Right. So sort of thinking about what you were saying there, you said a lot of different things. Thinking about how we can educate our patients and at the same time educate our doctors. What kinds of things are you thinking about from the, say, beginning, from the doctor perspective?
Well, I think the first thing to do was to get this out in the open. I mean, I think doctors in general take a lot of pride in their work. They work hard, they want to do a good job, and they don't take criticism necessarily well. So pulling data out from surveys to say, hey, look, there are definitely some things that you are doing that are probably not optimal in terms of getting patients enrolled in trials. For example, one of the surveys we did of the National ALS Research Group, also called the ALSRG, identified the fact that a percentage of doctors, maybe 15%, will take trials into their clinic that they themselves are not very excited about. Now, if you're going to lead a trial that you yourself is not very excited, they're not very excited about, how do you sell that to a patient? How do you get a patient excited if you yourself are not excited about the study, right? Another thing we found is that sometimes doctors, again, because they're stretched, they don't actually go into the room themselves and talk about research with the patient. They send somebody else in. Maybe the patient has never even seen this other person, the research nurse or the clinic coordinator, to talk about research. Mm-hmm. I think that's a problem, because when you look at other fields, like, for example, cancer, and you poll patients who did participate in cancer clinical trials, and you ask them, what was the number one reason why you decided to go into that trial? Overwhelming answer is because the doctor that I trusted the most told me they thought it was a good idea. And so I think it's so important that we take a few extra minutes and that we go into the room, we talk to patients about the clinical trial in an enthusiastic manner, and we not only educate them about the fact that it's an option, but we advocate for participation. I mean, I think almost all doctors would agree that that is the way we're going to get to a cure for ALS, by getting these trials done. So it's not like we're advocating for something that we don't believe in deep down inside.
Right, but at the same time, it seems to me also to think about, it must be what you're saying is also a huge challenge. What trials do you talk about? For example, a lot of what I'm hearing myself from patients is largely about DEX or MP001, and you can kind of sort of think to yourself, well, why is that? Is it because doctors maybe are most enthusiastic about those and not about others, or is it just that they're not aware of others because of how they've been brought to our attention?
I think it's a little bit of everything. I mean, I definitely think it's still very difficult to be aware of every single study that's going on. It's not uncommon in a given month for a patient to come in and ask me about a study that I've never heard of, even though, I mean, I think and read about ALS every single day of my life. I mean, there's things that come up, small studies at a single center someplace around the world that I was not even aware of. So I do think that we need to figure out a way to keep the pool of patients and doctors better informed about things. And again, that's not a problem that's unique to ALS. A lot of groups are struggling with this. But I mean, I think it's more than just that. I think all of us have limited resources, and all of us have to decide what clinical trials are the most interesting to us. There's no right or wrong answer. They're all exciting for different reasons, but no center can take on every clinical trial. And so I think a good strategy for docs would be to look across the board and to say, what's out there that really grabs your imagination as a physician? We all have our different, biases about what causes ALS and what strategies are most likely to work. And so take the studies that grab you personally, because those are the ones you're going to be the most enthusiastic about, that you're going to do the best job, recruiting patients into. That's my opinion.
But at the same time, it's a challenge right now. How do you find out about them? Because a lot of, people, we have a challenge right now of getting people really to work together, to talk to one another, and at the same time to find out that information. The information is in a lot of different places.
It is. It's getting better from a doctor standpoint because of the trial consortia that are springing up, like the Northeast ALS Consortium. So that consortium has done a great job of networking, large groups, large numbers of doctors and clinical teams together. I think there's well over 100 clinics that are part of the Northeast ALS Consortium. So it's not really the Northeast Consortium anymore. It's the worldwide consortium. Those groups will send out emails saying, hey, we've got a sponsor that's interested in testing this drug within our consortium. Which clinics are interested in potentially being a site for that trial. And so I just would ask my colleagues to think carefully when you decide that you want to be a site. Don't just do it to do it. Do it because it's something that grabs your attention that you are going to be excited about. I think that's so important. And at the same time, we're working to get better tools to keep patients informed. We do have clinicaltrials.gov. It's very comprehensive. It's not the most user-friendly site. That's what we've heard from some of our patients. And so we're developing tools like a trial concierge service, which is currently run through the NEALS Northeast ALS Consortium, where patients can call a number or send an email to a person, tell the person where they're from, sort of a little bit about their sort of clinical characteristics, and that person will help match them up to trials in their area that they might fit into. I think that's a great service.
And at the same time, you're working really hard to sort of just talk to patients about trials and how they can participate more, step up to the plate in this whole problem of trying to get a better drug for the disease. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've got this phrase that I use, which is called fight smart and not just hard. So every patient that I've come in contact with in the past 12 years of running the Duke ALS Clinic has wanted to roll up their sleeves and fight the disease in some way. But we all only have so many resources. We only all have so much time, so much energy, so much money. And I think that there is a path that would be the most efficient path for using those resources toward getting us all to a cure for ALS faster. And so in my opinion, that path would include getting yourself into a multidisciplinary ALS clinic where you're going to get the best care, the most options, which include not only clinical options, but research options. They include trying to participate in as many different kinds of research studies as you possibly can. Everyone in this country with ALS, no matter how long they've had it, can participate in the National ALS Registry. And there's many opportunities for patients to get involved in biomarker studies and genetic studies, as well as some of the early phase clinical trials that at this point tend to be a little bit restrictive. They're looking for certain kinds of patients, but hopefully we'll see that open up. And then finally, I'd like to see patients, if they have the remaining energy, to become advocates, to help us decide what drugs should we be studying. And they can help us there through things like ALS Untangled, and by coming to the Northeast ALS Consortium meeting and the International Symposium. What should our studies look like? If the studies that we have are too burdensome for many patients or too restrictive, help us design studies that are better. And then finally, help us spread the word, help us spread the awareness of research trials, why they're so important, what some of the barriers are, by becoming a research advocate. And we've worked together, the ALS Research Group, the Northeast ALS Consortium, the ALS Association. We've built a program called the Clinical Research Learning Institute. It's modeled after similar programs that were successful in cancer and in Parkinson's disease to train a group of ALS patients and families who are charismatic and talented to really become very knowledgeable about research so that they can answer some of the questions and address some of the misconceptions that patients have, but also to become the most potent advocates. We want to teach them how to give the most effective talk, PowerPoint talk, how to write the most effective letters to Congress, what are the opportunities for getting in front of policymakers and trial designers and things like that. And so we're about to open up our second Clinical Research Learning Institute, which will happen with the NEALS meeting later this year. And so after that meeting, we'll have 40 research ambassadors that are patients and family members that go around the country and spread the word about research opportunities and help us design better studies.
So this Learning Institute, your first meeting was October of 2011.
That's right.
And you're saying now that in just a couple of weeks, there's going to be another one?
It's going to be in October again, right after the Northeast ALS Consortium meeting. The faculty are all at that meeting, so in order to try to optimize our resources, we bring the patients in at the end of the meeting. We let them actually attend the meeting, and we also have our faculty right there so that we can give them the crash course in research and also give them some tips on how to be the most effective advocates.
So of our listeners now who are really interested in participating, is there still room, and how can they find out about it?
So this one's full. We usually make the decision over the summer. And if you're interested in participating in the third one, because at this point I'm almost certain that there's going to be another one. The first two were so successful in terms of interest, and the first group has been highly successful in terms of visibility on the internet. So they're great research ambassadors. If you're interested, meet with the person who's running your ALS clinic and let them know that you'd like to be a research ambassador, you'd like to be invited to this next year, and we get our nominations mostly from people who are within the Northeast ALS Consortium, but you can even email me if you're interested, or send me a little tweet through ALS Untangled, or go onto my Facebook page and send me a little blurb. There's all different ways for you to express your interest in this, and what we'll ask you to do is fill out a little application and tell us why you would be a good research ambassador. What kinds of skills do you have that would make you a good research ambassador? And really, we're looking for just a broad skill set. I mean, folks that are enthusiastic and energetic and have some sort of talent that is going to get people to pay attention to them. And that could be anything. I mean, we've had, when I went to the Parkinson's Clinical Research Learning Institute, I sat at a table with a movie star, a magician, a person who owned a chain of health clubs. So, I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of what that talent could be. But all of those people were very engaging and charismatic, and folks would pay attention to them. That's what we're looking for, some sort of skill set that makes people want to pay attention to what you're saying.
Great. So in closing then, thinking about all we've talked about today, what would you like to see happen going forward? What do you think are the most important things that can push us ahead, push us forward to a better drug for the disease?
I want to see more synergy between doctors and patients. I mean, for over 100 years, since the beginning of medicine, the field was very paternalistic. Patients would come to see a doctor, and the doctor would say, this is what you have, and this is what you need to do about it. And that would be the end of the story. There'd be no discussion. And over the past decade or so, I've seen the pendulum swing way in the opposite direction. There's a lot more focus on autonomy. And there's this movement now called do-it-yourself medicine, where folks are going out and getting their own medicines and taking their own medicines and inputting their own outcome measures into websites like Patients Like Me. And certainly, both of these things have their pros and cons. But the best place to me is in the middle. Obviously, the people who have the most at stake are the patients. And so, yes, their agenda needs to be paramount. But at the same time, physicians have decades of education and experience in medicine and training and research. And so, who better to be able to really fully elucidate the pros and cons of each decision for the patient so that they can make the most informed and best decision. And I think the same thing holds true when we're trying to design our research studies. There needs to be a synergy. It can't just be paternalistic or totally autonomous. We've got to work together to design patient-friendly studies that still, at the end of the day, give us enough information so that we can decide what things do we need to move ahead to the very resource-intensive but ultimately necessary phase 3 double-blind placebo-controlled studies. That's what I want to see.
So what you're thinking is, in some ways, a two-way conversation, the importance of a bouncing back between the patients and the doctors, and maybe even the scientists as well as all together. So in some ways, like Nuedexta, where you think about how you guys notice the patients were saying, hey, maybe this drug may help me speak or swallow in addition to helping me with that emotionality. So more of that. Is that what you have in mind?
That's a great example. Nuedexta is a great example. Most people know that drug was actually in trials because doctors and scientists decided that one of its ingredients was a glutamate antagonist, dextromethorphan, and therefore might work to slow ALS progression. And if that's all they paid attention to, if they had a very paternalistic mindset, and that's all they were looking for, and they didn't care about anything else, we would have missed a drug that actually really helps restore a lot of quality of life for patients. Because patients came to the table and said, hey, wait a minute, there's a symptom that was really troublesome to me that's much better. You guys need to look at this. This is important. And so because the doctors and scientists paid attention to the patients, it actually went back to the drawing board when it didn't work for the first indication, and it worked for the thing that the patients were saying. And I really think there needs to be more of that synergy as we move forward here in this field.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today, Rick. And this is Michelle Flum reporting from Cambridge, Massachusetts.